The Wilderness Stalker, new horror story enjoy. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the towering trees of the deep wilderness. Josh Barlow checked his map once more, confirming the route he had memorized earlier that day. He was heading towards Cedar Creek, a serene campsite he had read about online. It was a peaceful place where a river wound its way through the forest, and the dense woods offered solitude and tranquility. That's exactly what Josh needed after the long, stressful weeks of work that had drained him. As the trail narrowed, Josh was more than 3 hours deep into the forest. He had deliberately chosen this remote path, one far from the noise of civilization. The air was crisp, the scent of pine needles thick, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional call of a bird. But that calm, quiet wilderness would soon become suffocating. Josh's backpack was weighed down with all the essentials: a tent, a sleeping bag, and enough food and water for a couple of nights. He was prepared, or so he thought. As he walked, he relished the peaceful isolation, breathing deeply, feeling a sense of calm that had been missing from his life for months. About an hour from the campsite, the trail led into a steep descent toward a river. The sound of rushing water grew louder as he neared the crossing, and the sun had dipped closer to the horizon, sending streaks of orange and purple across the sky. The river wasn't wide, but it flowed swiftly, and Josh paused to assess the safest place to cross. His boots crunched on the rocks at the water's edge, and the cool breeze that came off the water sent a shiver through him. As he started to cross, stepping carefully on a series of large stones that rose just above the water's surface, something caused him to stop. There, on the opposite riverbank, where the trees grew thick and dark, was a shape, something large, hulking, and utterly still. He squinted, trying to make out details in the waning light, but all he saw was a shadow among shadows. The forest was dense there, and for a moment, Josh convinced himself it was a trick of the light, perhaps just an unusually large boulder or tree stump. Shaking his head, he dismissed the uneasy feeling that began to creep in. He continued his crossing, his boots slipping slightly on the slick stones, but he made it across without issue. The water rushed behind him, the sound soothing and constant. The trail picked up again on the far side, winding deeper into the woods. Josh took a quick glance over his shoulder at the river before heading up the trail. The shape was gone. Probably nothing, he muttered to himself, though his heart raced just a little faster. He pushed forward, eager to set up camp before darkness fully claimed the forest. The trail grew narrower, winding between thick trees and underbrush. The evening's light was quickly fading, and the forest began to shift around him, the colors draining into a deep, inky blue as night approached. A twig snapped behind him. Josh froze, mid-step. His mind raced. Maybe it was just a deer, but he hadn't seen any wildlife since he'd started his hike. Slowly, he turned his head to look behind him. Nothing. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and continued walking, his senses now heightened. His ears strained to pick up any sound other than the wind through the trees. Each step forward seemed to echo louder than before. Then he heard it again, a crackling, crunching sound like something large moving through the underbrush. This time it was unmistakable. Someone or something was behind him. Josh's pulse quickened, and he picked up his pace, hoping to reach the campsite soon. His eyes scanned the trees as he moved, every shadow and flicker of movement sending jolts of anxiety through him. His footsteps grew faster, his breathing shallower. He wasn't far now. The campsite was less than half a mile away. Another sound, a deep, low grunt. Josh stopped in his tracks, turning slowly. The trees stood tall and silent, but the shadows between them shifted unnervingly. A large shape loomed just beyond the trail, moving with slow deliberation. He couldn't make out what it was, only that it was huge. His mouth went dry, and his mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a moose or a large deer. Maybe, but no. Something in the way it moved sent a primal fear crawling up Josh's spine. It wasn't the lumbering gait of a deer or moose. It was something else, something predatory. Heart pounding, he resumed walking, faster now. Every instinct told him to run, but his rational mind urged him to remain calm. Don't run. Running triggers predators. He didn't want to believe what his gut was telling him, but deep down he knew. A bear. The word echoed in his mind, stoking his fear into a raging fire. Bears were known to stalk their prey, and Josh had heard stories of hikers who had been followed for miles before the attack came. He didn't want to be another story. The campsite was close. He could see the small clearing just ahead. His legs burned from the hurried pace, but he forced himself to keep moving. Behind him, the sounds of snapping twigs and rustling leaves grew closer. Josh didn't dare look back. He burst into the clearing, breathless, his heart thundering in his chest. The small campsite was surrounded by thick trees, and in the middle of the clearing, a fire pit sat unused. Josh quickly dropped his backpack, fumbling for the matches inside. He needed to make a fire fast. Bears avoided fire, didn't they? He hoped so. His hands shook as he struck a match, the tiny flame flickering in the growing darkness. He tossed it into the pit, where he had arranged some dry twigs and leaves. It caught, and the flames began to grow, casting an orange glow around the clearing. Josh backed away from the pit, scanning the treeline for any sign of movement. Nothing. The forest around him was eerily still. For a moment, Josh allowed himself to believe he was safe, that the bear, or whatever it was, had decided to leave him alone. Then he saw them, two glinting eyes reflecting the firelight from the darkness at the edge of the clearing. Josh's breath hitched, and his muscles locked in place. The bear was there, standing motionless, its hulking silhouette barely visible in the dim light. It watched him. Josh's heart hammered in his chest. The fire between them flickered, casting dancing shadows over the ground, but the bear didn't move. It just stared, its eyes unwavering. Seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Josh slowly reached for his pack, keeping his eyes on the bear. He needed to grab his bear spray. He had packed it, but now it seemed so far out of reach. His fingers brushed the zipper, and he began to pull it open as quietly as he could. The bear took a step forward. Josh froze. It was massive, far bigger than he had imagined. Its fur was thick and dark, blending into the night, and its breath came in slow, steady puffs, visible in the cool night air. It took another step, and the fire crackled between them, casting a brief flash of light over its face. Josh could see the intelligence in its eyes, a cold, calculating awareness. His hand found the bear spray, and he gripped it tightly, his heart racing. He couldn't run. There was nowhere to go. The bear was too fast, too strong. He raised the canister, aiming it toward the bear, his hand trembling. The bear stopped, its head lowering slightly as it sniffed the air, watching him with a terrifying calmness. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then in a blur of motion, the bear charged. Josh's instincts took over. He pressed the trigger, spraying a cloud of bear repellent directly toward the beast. The bear let out a deep, guttural roar, rearing back as the chemical stung its eyes and nose. It pawed at its face, shaking its massive head in anger and confusion. Josh didn't wait to see what happened next. He grabbed his backpack and bolted into the woods, his legs pumping with adrenaline. The sounds of the bear's rage echoed behind him as he ran, branches and leaves whipping at his face and arms. He didn't know where he was going, just away. The forest closed in around him, the trees a blur of black and green. His lungs burned, and his legs screamed for relief, but he couldn't stop. Not yet, not while the bear was still out there. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet gave way, and Josh tumbled down a steep slope, crashing through underbrush and loose rocks. He landed hard at the bottom, the wind knocked from his lungs. Pain shot through his side, but he forced himself to sit up, gasping for air. The river. He had stumbled back to the riverbank. The sound of rushing water filled his ears, and in the distance, he could hear the bear crashing through the trees, its fury undiminished. Josh scrambled to his feet, stumbling toward the river. He had to cross, had to put the water between him and the bear. His boots splashed into the freezing water, and he waded as fast as he could, the current pulling at his legs. The cold bit into his skin, but he pushed forward, heart racing. Halfway across, he dared to glance back. The bear had reached the edge of the trees, its massive form silhouetted against the night sky. It let out a roar that shook Josh to his core, but it didn't follow. Josh reached the far bank, collapsing in exhaustion. The bear paced along the river's edge, its eyes locked on him. For now, the water was his only shield. But as Josh lay there, gasping for breath, he knew the bear wouldn't stop. Not until it had him, and he had nowhere left to run. The scream was drowned out by the river.